This podcast is made possible by listeners like you. Go to our website at wdtatpodcast.com and click on support to learn how you can be part of this effort to learn how to have better conversations, increase compassion, and build bridges, not walls. You can make a one-time donation or become a patron for as little as $1 a month and receive patron-only benefits. This week's patron shout-out goes to Abe Jansen from Alberta, Canada. Thanks for supporting the podcast, Abe. And now, let's get to the interview. In this two-part interview, I talked to futurist Steve McDonald about spiral dynamics, which is a model for understanding human development and consciousness. It's a fascinating conversation that I think can help us understand ourselves and other people so much better. There's a lot of information to digest, so sharing this in two parts will hopefully help your digestion and not give you information heartburn. Welcome to the podcast where we talk about things we're not supposed to, learn how to have difficult conversations, and talk to people about what makes them different. This is the We Don't Talk About That with Lucas Land podcast, where we do talk about that with me, Lucas Land.
It's never the right place or time. It's imperceptible to the eye. It's never the right place or time.
My guest today is Steve McDonald. He is a futurist and the founder of the Agency for Advanced Development of Integrative Intelligence. Integrative or integrative? I don't even know.
Yeah, you can say it either way. Same thing.
You could say it either way. You're from Australia. I should say that first because that's why I want to check my pronunciations, because I'm thinking as we were talking that, maybe I'm getting an Australian accent.
Yeah.
But the AADII is a nonprofit change agency. And you're also the founder of Future Sense, a podcast and radio show that broadcasts from Byron Bay, Australia. So welcome to We Don't Talk About That.
Thanks, Lucas. It's great to be here.
Yeah. So, Steve, tell us first just a little bit about yourself. I said you're at Byron Bay, Australia, but what are you up to? And tell us just a little bit about who you are.
Sure. I guess I'm a futurist and a change agent, and I'm particularly interested in the evolution of human consciousness and the future of human existence. And I've got a very diverse background. So I spent 15 years as a career Army officer here in Australia. For some of that time, I was a reconnaissance helicopter pilot. And for most of my Army time, I was an officer in the infantry. So sort of grassroots commanding combat soldiers. And I went to war in Somalia, Africa in 1993 on a humanitarian mission. And that was primarily a US-led response to a widespread famine, which had been caused by a civil war in Somalia. So we went over there to quieten down the civil war so that the UN could resume feeding people again. And not long after that deployment, a couple of years later, I got out of the Army, went through a bit of a unclear phase of not knowing what was next for me, but I ended up going back to flying and flew a rescue helicopter for 5 years, so working in emergency services. And then while I was doing that, I started to do some training and consulting work on the side because I had a lot of management experience from my time in the Army. And that eventually got me into full-time management consulting, and then I specialized in change management after a while. And I discovered Claire Graves' work back in 2003, and around the same time I was also introduced to Ken Wilber's work as well. And from my reasonable experience of the different encounters you can have with human nature, from war through to all sorts of extreme experiences in emergency services, what I read of Claire Graves' description of human nature seemed a really good fit with my experience. And so straight away, I sort of gravitated towards learning more about that. I did some formal training with Don Beck, who was one of the authors of the Spiral Dynamics book, first in Australia, then I went to Texas a year later. And eventually I got qualified to teach Spiral Dynamics Integral, which was under the auspices of Don Beck's school. I also, during that period, I struggled with post-traumatic stress from my work in the military and emergency services, and that knocked me over for about 7 months. I couldn't work and went through a fairly extreme sort of healing process there. But it was it was also a breakthrough process as well. So, developmentally, because I'd read about Claire Graves' material, I could see it as being a transformational process, and that was really useful for me. And then in more recent years, I have established a charitable foundation, which is essentially a non-profit change agency, as you described, and it has a global focus. So I'm particularly interested in the global challenges that humanity is facing and will face in the near future, and how we can improve human coping capacity by understanding how to transform human consciousness. And really the root of pretty much all of our issues that we have in society, it comes down to human values. And if we can understand human values better and how they change and how to work with the change process, then that offers an avenue to a more cohesive and collaborative global society.
Yeah, one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you is exactly what you're talking about. That and I assume spiral dynamics is a big part of that. When I first encountered spiral dynamics, what was really helpful to me was that it helped me be more compassionate to people that were in other memes or were different than me. I could see where their values were and where they were at. So tell us a little more about, I know we're not going to be able to really plumb the full depths of spiral dynamics in an hour or so, and we can share some links for people to go deeper later, but just on a general level, what was Claire Graves' kind of initial idea about how human consciousness sort of developed, and how might that help us see people differently? And then maybe we can get into the colors.
Sure. I think one thing that's different about Claire Graves' research is most people, when they're wanting to do a research project, they come up with a hypothesis and then they want to try and prove whether it's true or not. Graves started with an open-ended question, and that's what really marks his work as unusual and very insightful. So he was a contemporary of Abraham Maslow. There were a number of theories around at that time about the development of human nature and psychology, and most of them had no more than 7 levels, like stepped levels or stages that we grow through during our life. And all of the models around really had a kind of a pinnacle, the pinnacle of human existence. This is what you can achieve, and it's the highest thing you can achieve. And so Graves was teaching psychology in upstate New York, and on the course that he taught, there were 5 different perspectives on human psychology that came from different sources. And inevitably, one of the students would put their hand up at the end of the course and say, Dr. Graves, which one of these is right? and it was really frustration around those questions that drew him to start his own research. So his research was based around the question, what is the nature of a psychologically mature adult? And with that open question, he then had quite a diverse range of data gathering methods, from self-reporting from university students to unannounced observation of behavior, which probably wouldn't be ethical, these days. And he also, he studied all sorts of parallel research as well into biology, the study of brain structure and that kind of stuff. And I guess there are 3 main things that really came out of his research. And he was also smart enough to know that if he was the only guy analyzing his data, then his own perspective on the world would flavor the outcome. So what he did was he gathered a team of 7 peers, whom he called his judges, and he would give his data to the judges and just say, have a look at this and see what patterns you can find. So it was a very open approach that he took, and very non-directive, which I think, again, is why he came up with such valuable information. And I could summarize his findings in kind of 3 areas. The first one is he found this interesting relationship between the complexity of life conditions and the responsive and adaptive nature of human consciousness. And he represented that as like a double helix pattern where life conditions were one strand and the human consciousness was the other strand. And as the life conditions changed, then human consciousness responded, and as necessary, it either became more complex or less complex to match what the life conditions were demanding. And that in itself is a really profound finding. And I guess one of the key messages out of that is that life conditions and the complexity of our life conditions in particular, and you can interpret that as being the complexity or the difficulty of the challenges that we face in life, is one way of thinking about that. That's the key driver for change. So much, so often in the world we see people trying to change other people through logical argument or emotional pressure, or some other kind of tool. And yet it all comes back to the life conditions, and it's something that's often overlooked. So whatever pressure is put on a person, they're just going to fall back to whatever the life conditions are demanding of them. So if we can in the future redirect our change efforts to look first and foremost at life conditions and make sure that the life conditions are there to support whatever it is that we're hoping to create, then that offers a completely new avenue for change, which I think will be much more successful. So the second piece that came out of his research was an understanding of the human experience of change. And this is essentially, it's like a pathway or a pattern that represents the change process. And many other people who've worked on this, Joseph Campbell called it the hero's journey. Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross did some wonderful work on this same pattern, but she worked with dying patients who are adapting psychologically to the death process. And the same change pattern can be found in the I Ching, the ancient book of changes from China, and many, many other, cultural products from different cultures around the world. So we're basically talking about the fundamental way that everything changes in this reality, and you can reduce it like to its most simple form as basically a sine wave. But a more sophisticated understanding sees it as not as a flat wave or even a flat circle, but as a spiral. So we go through cycles, and at the completion of a cycle, we may stay the same, we may grow and move up the spiral, or we may regress down the spiral as well. So just understanding that basic pattern, that we start from stability. When life conditions change, we feel discomfort. Our normal response to that is usually to look backwards to the past and try and remember a time when things worked okay. So we usually go through this regressive values search to look through the back catalogue and find if an old way of living is going to make things better. And what that usually does is it makes things worse, and so it speeds up the change process. So that's a neat little trick that evolution put into the change process to make it quicker. And of course, the world, speaking super generally, the world right now is in that regressive value search where things have changed. We're not quite sure how they should be, so we're looking backwards and going back to sort of, right wing, extreme left wing kind of behaviors and that kind of thing. And then eventually we sort of move through that discomfort phase into the transformation, which is like a chaotic time where everything falls apart. We completely let go of our old value structures, and we are personally transformed. So that includes our body chemistry, our neural networks, those sorts of things. And then we have a breakthrough, like an enlightening moment where suddenly we can see the world from a different perspective, and suddenly we see that, there are new ways to live. And we break out of that chaos and into a renewal zone, which is highly energized, and then come back to a stability, which usually brings a higher level of coping capacity. So that was the second sort of packet of information that he produced, which is really useful. And the third one was an understanding of the layered nature of human values and human development, that there are these steps or stages or layers that we grow through from when we're born to when we become a mature adult. And again, it's driven by our capacity to interact with our life conditions and the complexity of those life conditions as to how quick we might grow through these stages. But everybody grows through the same ones, and they're sort of represented in spiral dynamics as V-means. I think that is the language they use there. So each one of those represents a discrete framework for making sense of reality. And so it's embedded very deep in us. It seems to be pre-coded because everybody seems to go through the same process. And it shows up on the surface level as what we feel is important, what motivates us, what doesn't motivate us, our general values, our ethics, and our behavior. So all of those things change when we transform or we transition from one value system to the next.
Yeah.
So those three things, the relationship with life conditions, the change process, and then the values progression,
Okay, so listeners, if you didn't get all of that, you can rewind and go back through it. I was taking notes, and I'm going to re-listen to it too because there was a lot of good stuff there. Because I think for a lot of people, if they've never heard some of these ideas before, it can be a lot at once. But that's a really good kind of basis for understanding how he sort of, or I guess, was it Don Beck that then developed the sort of colors of spiral dynamics?
Yeah, it was Don Beck and his co-author, Christopher Cowan, were the ones who developed the colors. And that was at the time when Don was going to South Africa and working there. So that came after Graves had passed away, I believe,
Yeah. So for me, just to maybe simplify some of what you're saying, the things I find really, really helpful in these basic things that Claire Graves was researching and finding, one is that we all go through these stages of development. In a lot of the other systems, it's easy to maybe see them as layered or leveled in a way that says, there's people at the bottom that are sort of primitive or backwards, and then there's people at the top that are better. And what I appreciate about spiral dynamics is, no, we all go through, and then as you said, like you can also kind of go back. You keep going around cycles, and sometimes you're moving forward, and sometimes you're moving backwards, and that it just fits a lot better with the reality, I think, of human experience.
It does,
that we all go through those different stages. Yeah.
And when I started teaching spiral dynamics in the corporate world, I particularly here in Australia, I guess because of the cultural differences between Australia and the US, I ran into an obstacle in the language, the jargon that was being used in the spiral dynamics book. And it was like people had to learn the language of spiral dynamics first, then they had to learn the concepts. And it was like an unnecessary step. So I started to change the language that I was using. And I eventually settled on the word layers to describe the stages or V-means. And I use layers because they are nested inside each other. So they're like the layers on an onion, or those Russian dolls. You open a big Russian doll and there's a whole bunch of little ones inside it. So as we grow, we start out at the basic sort of beige, survival, hunter-gatherer kind of value set, and then the next value set gets layered over the top of that, and the next one layered over the top of that. And so even if we're operating from a quite sophisticated value system, we still have all of these basic value systems inside us. and we can very
right.
quickly spiral back down to them if life conditions demand that of us.
Yeah, and what I notice is so helpful is that we often, and I want to get to the colors and kind of break down some of the memes for people quickly, but I've heard some people say like the U.S. There's a certain percentage of the U.S. that consider themselves like progressives that are in this green meme, but part of the problem is they see themselves in this green meme. And they're looking down on the rest of, those backwards other memes that are retrograde and can't catch up, and so they sort of see themselves as having arrived right at the pinnacle. Yeah. And then so what's brilliant and beautiful about spiral dynamics is it says, no, you still are all those other memes.
That's right.
And maybe and your job is really actually, instead of saying, hey, why don't you catch up to me and be like me, is to help everybody be the healthiest version of where they're at so that they can continue to grow and develop.
Yeah,
right?
I agree 100%. Yeah.
And that's such a shift in how we approach like everything.
Yeah, it is. One of the interesting things about Graves' model is the model predicts that people will interpret it and use it in different ways depending on which value system they're operating through at the time, right?
Oh, yeah.
So that is also a tricky thing when it comes to the real world knowledge and application of spiral dynamics. So it depends where someone's at when they learn about the model as to how they perceive it and how they might use it. It makes it quite an interesting and rich topic. But one of the things in the first tier of consciousness, which is the first 6 layers or stages, so that's from hunter-gatherer right up to relativistic or postmodern green. There's an inbuilt rejection factor. So whenever we make a value shift and grow to the next value system, we automatically reject where we've came from. And so that, that is an obstacle to the application of the model. It's only really when we start to poke into second tier and we start to be able to have those, sort of very clean insights without any rejection bias that we come to the kind of conclusion that you just made, that, okay, the best thing we can do is actually to nurture everybody and help everybody be helpful where they're at.
Yeah. Okay. Well, before we get too deep into that, let's back up. I'm thinking I'm gonna link in the show notes to a visual. Maybe you have one that's your favorite or one that you've created, and I've seen some others that I can link to. So I would encourage people, as you're listening, maybe go to the show notes and get a picture of the colors as we're kind of talking through the different colors to help you visualize the idea of spiral dynamics and what we're talking about. So give us a brief. I know there's a lot to unpack in all the layers and all of the memes, but give us a brief rundown of the colors in spiral dynamics.
Sure. So the model that Graves came up with, it's a fractal model. In other words, you can look at it from a different scale and it looks the same. So you can apply these colors or layers to the individual experience that we have growing through life.
Right.
And you can apply it also to a whole species level and everything in between those scales. So what I'll do as I just quickly go through each one of the colors or layers is I'll talk about it from both of those places, from an individual and a species level. And that'll help people understand it a little bit better. So starting out at beige, which is layer 1, at a species level, we're talking about the first emergence of Homo sapiens from whatever we were before that. So hunter-gatherer kind of existence, very much embedded in nature and working in harmony with nature. And pretty much almost on automatic in terms of life, really just responding to our immediate needs for, hunger, shelter, those sorts of things. And at an individual level, that is representing when we're first born as a baby, where we're kind of helpless. We're just eating and sleeping and existing. And there's no sort of richness of culture or anything around life. It's like the whole, wow, discovering the world and trying to make sense of it and just surviving. And that's an individually oriented layer. And as we go up the layers, they alternate between individual and communal focus. So from the individual beige, we go to the communal tribal, which at an individual level represents like early family life, where mom and dad are kind of like the heads of the tribe, and the tribe has customs, things that are okay to do and things that are not okay to do. And you have to kind of learn what the customs of, and just follow the guidance of the heads of the tribe. And of course, at a species level, that is literally, the old traditional tribal living, where you've got a tribal head, usually a chief, historically in our history, and the group, is generally I consider to be up to about 150 people in a tribe. Roughly, you've got a piece of tribal land that you live on that has a boundary around it, and life is pretty much lived inside that tribal boundary. It has an animistic form of spirituality. So at the first level beige, there's no real structured spirituality that we've been able to understand, because there's no real strong written records of life at that stage so long ago. But certainly there was this explosion of tribal culture around about 50,000 years ago, and part of that was the development of an animistic form of spirituality where every physical thing is seen to have a spirit within it. So the mountain has a spirit, the river has a spirit, the plant has a spirit, these kind of things. And thinking in the communal systems is very long-term, whereas thinking in the individual systems tends to be short-term. So in tribal societies, you have these, like here in Australia, in our Aboriginal culture, we have stories that we know are 30,000 years old, because they talk about astronomical events that happened 30,000 years ago that science has detected, those kind of things. It's amazing to think that stories can carry knowledge for so long throughout history. And what happens with each of these layers is when we live life according to the values of a particular layer, at first it's very, very useful, but it goes through a cycle where it peaks, and then after a while, because the universe we live in is always becoming more complex, the growing complexity makes our value set have an expiry date. And so there comes a time when a particular way of living no longer works so well, and we have to transform to the next most complex layer or color in order to solve our problems. And so after living the tribal way for a while, we find that, okay, it's not working so well anymore. We go through this subconscious transformational process driven by life conditions. So the next or third layer, layer 3, is red, which Claire Graves called egocentric. And you can think of it from an individual perspective as the time when you start to become a teenager, go through puberty. You've got all these different hormonal and emotional drivers happening. You want to break out of the control structure of the family. You don't want to follow your mum and dad's orders anymore. You want to make your own mark on life, discover who you are, discover your own power. And you go through that wild phase in your teenage years of breaking the rules and just doing whatever you want to do, and just to see what happens, right? And at a species level, that equates to the breakout from tribal living into a roaming warlord kind of existence, which you still see in places like Somalia, for example. And maybe the biggest example in history was Genghis Khan. There's a great movie about Genghis Khan called Mongol, which shows him growing up in a tribal setting. And then these raiders come in and kill his relatives and wreck the tribe. And that pressure is enough to transform him into one of these warlords. And of course, history shows I think he conquered more land on the planet than anybody else has so far. So it's egocentric, as Claire Graves said. It's very self-centered, and it's about changing the world to suit what you feel you need. And it tends to typically be confronting, raw. It's still not really engaging the rational mind so much. It's very much driven by pre-rational urges, instincts, wants, and needs. So still quite primal. And in everyday society, we kind of play this out in sport. You know, we use sport as an outlet for that kind of raw emotional power orientation. And after a while, again, life conditions change, driving us to change to a more complex way of being. And we move to the fourth layer, which is coded blue in spiral dynamics. Claire Graves called it absolutistic. And it takes us into a new zone, which I call the rational zone, because up until now in 1, 2, and 3, we've been primarily driven by emotions, instincts, basic needs. Whereas once we move from 3 to 4, the frontal lobes develop to completion. And so our rational mind takes charge, and we're able to rationalize away some of our emotions and urges, you know, and we start to conceive of cause and effect relationships. So we can live in a much more disciplined and structured way. And that change in humanity historically came about around the time of the agricultural revolution, where we learned how to crop on a large scale. So we didn't have to spend all day working on subsistence farming or gathering food. We could actually settle down and build towns and large cities and have, you know, specialized people doing the large scale agriculture to feed us. And the complexity, the extra complexity that came from living in large groups like that meant that we had to develop this rational minded approach that allowed us to follow rule sets and live a disciplined life, you know, so that we could just live cohesively within towns and cities. So the mindset that comes with this, and from a personal perspective, this is kind of when you've run yourself ragged as a teenager, you know, living the wild life, and you suddenly have this realization that, okay, I've got to knuckle down and, you know, get on path here. I can't just live my life like this because I need a regular income. I need, you know, future goals and those sorts of things. So that's when we kind of settle down into more mainstream life, when we move into this fourth layer. And the thinking associated with it is typically looking for a higher authority to give us written guidance on how to live our life. So we're basically looking for a set of rules from a higher authority. And often for many people that comes in the form of religion. And it was around this, you know, this time in history when humanity emerged into this fourth way of being human, that the religious books from our main structured religions, you know, were written from this kind of mindset of there's a set way to live. There's only one right way to live, actually. And here are the rules for that. And if you follow those rules, then everything will be good. And the rewards for that come way in the future, because we're in a communal system and it's long-term thinking. So you hear people from this mindset saying, okay, if I do really well in my career, you know, by the time I retire, I'm going to get a gold watch and I'll have all this money saved up and, you know, things will be great. And from a religious point of view, if you live a good life, follow God's rules, then when you die, you'll go to heaven and be rewarded there. So the rewards always come later in this mindset. And then, as with all the value systems, after a certain time, if your life conditions become more complex, then you'll also transition out of this one. And so it really does come back to life conditions. And there are still places on the planet where people are living quite happily at tribal layer 2, you know, like in the wild rainforests of Papua New Guinea, for example, just north of Australia, because they don't need to live any different. You know, they have everything they need. Their life conditions have stayed stable for thousands of years. And there's been no driver for them to move out of that value system. So the movement...
there are areas, just real quick, there's areas of Bolivia, in the Amazon, in kind of northern Bolivia, where there are tribes that haven't been contacted, and luckily they have some protections that they are left alone. But I know people feel like we've encroached on so many places and it's hard to imagine people living like that, but these are modern people living that way. So
yeah,
it's true.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And it also speaks to the power and the resilience of these simpler value systems, basic survival, basic tribal and family bonds, basic power requirements, that they are able to last so long successfully, and they, like I said, they don't go away. They're still nested inside us, even when we're living in more complex places.
Well, I'm pausing you maybe kind of halfway through to reflect on this, because it tickles some of the things I'm always interested in, but part of it is our very, very short memories that we have as human beings, to not remember that for 90+% of Homo sapiens existence, we did exist in more tribal groupings. And so, of course, they lasted that long. They've outlasted us already, right, for thousands of years, compared to the short amount of time that we've been in the kind of civilization that we are now.
Yeah.
So this is where we'll end part 1 of our conversation. Stay tuned next week for the conclusion of this conversation with Steve McDonald. Thanks for joining us today on We Don't Talk About That with Lucas Land. If you like what you hear, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any episodes. Help us spread the word by sharing it on social media. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram with the handle @WDTAT Podcast. You can also rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. You can support the podcast by visiting our website at wdtatpodcast.com and clicking on support. You can make a one-time donation or consider becoming a monthly supporter through Patreon. You'll receive bonus content and access to patron-only benefits. Thanks for your support. We would love to hear from you. Leave us a voicemail by going to our website and clicking Send Voicemail. Your voicemail could be featured in a future episode. You can also email us at wdtatpodcast@gmail.com. Many thanks to Neil Curran and Infielder for the use of their music. You can find more of their music online at infielder.bandcamp.com. A final thought from Brené Brown. The willingness to show up changes us. It makes us a little braver each time. Until next time, keep showing up and keep being brave.
What are you gonna do?
Que le vaya bien.